"You can keep the dog," Grant said. "But the airstrip is mine by Friday." Owen stood inside the hangar, one hand on the contract, the other on Ranger's collar. The Cessna behind him looked dead. Dust on the windshield, flat tires, nothing worth saving. "Your father wasted his life out here," Grant said. "Don't waste yours." Owen almost signed. Then Ranger pulled free, crossed the concrete, and stopped at a hidden panel no one had opened in 9 years. One old box, one sentence inside. And suddenly Grant Whitmore wasn't buying land anymore. He was trying to bury a legacy. At 41, after 12 years of marriage and 4 years of trying to become the kind of civilian everyone told him he should be, Owen Mercer walked out of the Ada County Courthouse with a cardboard box, a tired Ford F-150, one German Shepherd with gray around his muzzle, and the deed to an abandoned airstrip nobody else wanted. Marla kept the house on Juniper Street, the newer SUV, the furniture they had bought on credit, and the savings account that had somehow become smaller every time Owen asked about it. Owen kept Ranger because no judge in Idaho could separate a man from the dog who still woke him from dreams before he drowned in them. He also kept Juniper Ridge Airfield, a strip of cracked grass and sunburned dirt tucked west of Dry Creek Valley, Montana, along with a rusted metal hangar, a tin-roofed shack, and an old Cessna 206 that had not lifted its nose toward the sky in 9 years. Marla's attorney had called it non-performing real property, as if the land had failed a test. He said it was appraised at $11,000, mostly because the county could not decide whether to tax it as aviation property, farmland, or junk. Nobody argued over it. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody even looked at Owen when the papers slid across the table. Some men lose fortunes in divorce. Owen lost the little evidence that he had ever belonged anywhere. The courtroom smelled like floor cleaner and warm paper. A ceiling fan ticked overhead with the patience of something that had watched too many endings to care about one more. Owen signed where the attorney pointed. His signature looked smaller each time he wrote it, as if the pen were shaving pieces off him. When it was done, Marla stood, smoothed the front of her cream-colored blouse, and thanked her lawyer in a voice she used for bank tellers and distant cousins. She did not look at Owen. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe that was the last form of honesty left between them. Outside, the September sun hit the courthouse steps hard and white. Owen carried the cardboard box against his hip. Inside were 2 work shirts, a dented thermos, a stack of service records from the Army, a framed photograph of him and Ranger taken beside a transport helicopter in Texas, and a coffee mug from the repair shop that had laid him off 6 weeks earlier. 12 years of marriage and 22 years of learning how to be useful had been reduced to things that rattled when he walked. Ranger waited in the truck bed under the shade of the cab, ears lifting the moment he saw Owen. The old Shepherd had once moved like a blade through tall grass, sharp, silent, certain. Now his hips rose slowly, and his left ear carried a permanent fold from age, not injury, but his eyes were still the same. Amber, steady, almost too knowing. Owen set the box in the passenger seat and rested one hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into his palm with quiet force, the way he had done in barracks rooms, motel parking lots, and the laundry room floor on nights. Owen could not explain why his hands were shaking. "Well," Owen said, though his voice came out rougher than he expected, "looks like it's you and me again." Ranger blinked once, slow and solemn, as if the arrangement had never been in doubt. Owen sat behind the wheel for a long while. The truck's dashboard was cracked in 3 places, and the air conditioner worked only when the road was flat and the Lord was feeling generous. His checking account held $390. The repair shop in Boise had been sold to a company out of Phoenix, and the new manager had liked Owen's resume until he realized Owen did not smile easily for customers. The apartment applications wanted proof of income. The bank wanted answers. Marla wanted distance. Owen wanted nothing, which frightened him more than wanting too much. Then he saw the deed lying on top of the legal folder, its corners softened from years in a file cabinet. Juniper Ridge Airfield, Dry Creek County, Montana, transferred under the estate of Thomas Avery Mercer, deceased. His father's name sat there in black ink, calm as a stone. Thomas Mercer had been dead 9 years, but the sight of that name still put a hand around Owen's ribs. To half of western Montana, Thomas had been a mountain pilot, a man who could read wind off a ridge line and land where sensible people would not park a tractor. To Owen, he had been a voice on the radio, a pair of oil-stained hands, a man always leaving at dawn because someone, somewhere, needed him more. Owen had gone back for the funeral, stayed 3 days, locked the shack, mailed the keys to himself, and never returned. He had told himself the place was grief with a property tax bill attached. Now it was the only thing with his name on it. The drive north took most of the day. Interstate gave way to 2-lane highway, then to county road, then to a washboard track that rattled the truck so hard the glove box popped open. Ranger sat upright in the back, nose lifted, reading the wind as the city thinned behind them, and the land widened into gold grass, dark pine, and the long blue shoulders of the Bitterglass Range. No snow softened the world here. It was late summer turning to fall, all dust and dry weeds and sun lying low over the hills like old brass. The air smelled of sage, hot metal, and something Owen had not realized he remembered: avgas, cedar, and the mineral bite of Montana dirt. When the sign finally appeared, he almost missed it. Juniper Ridge Airfield. The letters were faded, the post leaning, the chain at the gate red with rust. Owen killed the engine. Silence gathered quickly, except for the ticking of the cooling hood and Ranger's soft breath behind him. Beyond the gate, the grass runway stretched unevenly toward the hills, half swallowed by weeds. The hangar stood at the far end, its metal siding weathered dull and brown, one corner sagging like a tired shoulder. Beside it sat the shack, smaller than Owen remembered, with a porch warped by heat and time. And inside the hangar, visible through the gap in the sliding door, waited the Cessna. Its white paint had yellowed, its blue stripe had peeled. Dust lay thick across the windshield. The tires sagged against the earth. It looked less like a machine than a creature that had folded its wings and given up. Owen stared at it, feeling nothing at first, then too much. Ranger jumped down from the truck before Owen could stop him, landed carefully, and walked to the gate. He did not bark. He simply stood there, facing the airstrip, tail low, ears forward. Owen laughed once under his breath, without humor. "Don't get sentimental," he told the dog. "We're here to sell it." Ranger did not turn around. A breeze moved over the runway, bending the dry grass in one long, whispering wave, and for a moment the whole place seemed to inhale. Owen reached for the rusted chain, and the old gate gave way with a sound like something waking after years of being forgotten. The gate complained all the way open, a long iron groan that rolled across the empty field and came back thinner from the hills. Owen pushed until the chain dragged loose through the weeds, then stood there with one hand on the post, looking at Juniper Ridge the way a man looks at a room where someone has died and nobody has moved the furniture. There was no snow to make the place pretty, no white blanket to soften rust or hide neglect. September had left everything exposed. The runway was a strip of tired grass, yellow at the tips, flattened in places by deer and wind. Grasshoppers snapped away from Owen's boots. Dust lifted around his ankles and settled on his jeans like old flour. Far beyond the field, the Bitterglass Range rose in layers of blue and brown, not dramatic enough for postcards, but honest, the kind of mountains that did not beg to be admired and did not forgive carelessness. Ranger crossed the threshold first. He moved slowly, nose low, following scents Owen could not name. Field mice in the grass, sunbaked oil, dry cedar, the faint chemical ghost of aviation fuel that had somehow survived 9 summers in the dirt. The dog paused every few yards, not wandering, not playing, but inspecting, as if the place had asked to be remembered properly. Owen followed with the legal folder tucked under one arm and the cardboard box balanced against his hip. The airfield looked smaller than it had in his memory and bigger than he was ready for. The shack stood near the hangar, its tin roof patched in 2 places, its windows filmed with dust. A porch chair sat tipped against the wall, one leg broken gray from years of sun. The screen door hung slightly open. It moved when the breeze touched it, tapping the frame with a dry little sound that made Owen think of knuckles on a coffin lid. "Real charming," he muttered. Ranger looked back, unimpressed. Inside the shack, heat sat trapped in the room, stale and heavy. Owen opened the door wider and let the afternoon light pour across the floorboards. Everything seemed paused mid-breath. His father's work jacket still hung from a nail near the stove. A chipped enamel cup sat beside the sink. A stack of aeronautical charts lay curled on the table, their edges browned and brittle. On one wall, a calendar from 9 years ago still showed August, as if Thomas Mercer had meant to turn the page and simply stepped outside for a moment. Owen set the box down and felt something tighten behind his sternum. He had spent years telling himself his father had been impossible to know, a man built out of weather reports and engine noise. But standing there surrounded by ordinary things, a pencil worn short, a pair of reading glasses, a receipt folded under a coffee tin, Owen felt the discomfort of evidence. Thomas had not been a legend in this room. He had been a man who forgot to throw away old receipts, a man who drank coffee too late, a man who slept on a narrow cot beneath a roof that popped at night when the air cooled. Ranger walked to the table and placed his chin near the old charts. Not on them, exactly. Near them. Owen watched him for a moment, then looked away because the dog's stillness made the room feel witnessed. He left the shack and crossed toward the hangar, where the big sliding doors sat crooked on their track. It took both hands and one hard pull to open them enough to step through. The smell hit him first: dust, rubber, old oil, sun-warmed metal, and the deep dry scent of things sealed too long from weather. Light entered in a narrow blade and cut across the Cessna's nose. The airplane sat in the center of the hangar like a grounded memory. A Cessna 206, white once, with a faded blue stripe running along the fuselage, its paint blistered in spots, windshield clouded, wings stretching into shadow. Owen had learned to change spark plugs under that left wing. He had once fallen asleep against that tire, while his father argued with a radio that would not transmit. He had also waited beside this same airplane on more birthdays than he cared to count, listening to the sky for an engine that arrived after dark. "You picked everybody else," he said quietly, before he knew he was going to say it. The words sounded childish in the hangar, small and ashamed of themselves. Ranger stepped beside him and leaned his shoulder into Owen's leg. No drama, no demand, just wait. Owen rested his hand on the shepherd's head and stared at the Cessna until the shape blurred a little at the edges. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, hissing along the runway. It did not sound empty anymore. It sounded like a place waiting to be answered. Owen told himself he would spend one night at Juniper Ridge, maybe two, if the lock on the hangar fought him. Then call a land broker in Missoula and let someone else decide what the place wanted to become. A private ranch entrance, a weekend retreat, a fenced-off field with a tasteful sign and no memory attached. That was the clean thing. The practical thing. The kind of decision Marla would have approved of if approving still belonged to her. By sunset, the heat had loosened its grip, and the sky had gone the color of old copper. Owen dragged a mattress from the wall of the shack, beat the dust from it with a broom, and laid his sleeping bag over the top, because he did not trust anything his father had slept on to be free of mice or ghosts. Ranger circled twice near the door, then settled, where he could see both the room and the runway through the screen. The dog had always chosen thresholds. Motel doors, garage bays, hospital waiting rooms, anywhere Owen might need guarding without admitting it. Owen opened a can of beans, ate them cold with a plastic spoon, and tried not to look too long at the small things still arranged around the shack. Thomas Mercer's ball cap hung on a peg by the stove, sun-bleached along the brim. His work gloves lay folded on the counter, stiff with age. A jar of screws sat beside the sink, each screw sorted by size in a way that made Owen angry for no reason he could explain. His father had been careful with hardware, careful with flight plans, careful with fuel, careful with strangers. But with Owen, he had been all weather delays and unfinished sentences. Owen remembered being 17, waiting on this very porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold, rehearsing the question he had carried for weeks. "Why don't you ever stay?" He never asked it. Thomas landed after dark, tired and sunburned, smelling of oil and high air, and before Owen could speak, the phone rang inside the shack. Someone needed a ride across the mountains. Someone always needed something. Thomas looked at his son with apology already forming in his eyes, and Owen hated that look more than the leaving. He hated being made noble without his permission. He hated being expected to understand. Years later, in the army, Owen had become exactly the kind of man who moved when called. He fixed engines under deadline, loaded supplies with bad coffee in his stomach, learned how to keep his hands steady while everyone else moved too fast. People trusted him because he did not waste words. Supervisors called him dependable. Friends called him solid. Marla at first called him safe, then quiet, then distant, then impossible. Maybe they were all right. Maybe a man could survive every assignment handed to him and still fail the simple work of sitting at a kitchen table and saying, "I am not okay." Ranger rose sometime after dark and came to Owen's side. The old shepherd pressed his head beneath Owen's hand, insisting without noise. Owen scratched the fur between his ears and felt the familiar ridge of bone, the warmth of a living creature who had never once asked him to explain himself in complete sentences. "I don't know what we're doing here," Owen whispered. Ranger looked toward the table. The aeronautical charts still lay there, curled at the corners. Owen stood, more to stop the dog from staring than because he cared, and lifted the top chart. Beneath it was a photograph he had not noticed before. Thomas stood beside the Cessna, younger than Owen was now, one hand on the propeller, smiling at someone outside the frame. Not posing, not performing, just caught in a moment of unguarded light. Owen turned the photo over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were 5 words: "Keep the runway open." No explanation, no date, no soft confession from the dead. Just an instruction, practical and impossible. Owen let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Of course," he said. "Even now you leave me a job." But he did not throw the photograph away. He set it carefully beside the lamp. Outside, the runway had disappeared into darkness, yet Owen could feel it there. A long, silent line cut through the grass, pointing towards somewhere he had spent half his life refusing to go. That night, sleep came in broken pieces. He woke once to Ranger standing over him, calm but alert, and for a few seconds Owen forgot the courthouse, the divorce, the empty bank account. He only heard the wind sliding over the roofie and the faint ticking of cooling metal from the hangar. He was alive. He knew that. But lying in his father's shack, beneath a sky crowded with stars he had not seen in years, Owen wondered when being alive had stopped feeling like living. Morning came without tenderness. The sun rose hard over the eastern ridge, spilling pale gold across the runway and showing Owen everything darkness had been kind enough to hide. The grass was worse than he thought, waist-high along the edges, thick with burrs and pale seed heads. A section of fence near the service road had collapsed. The fuel shed leaned to one side, its door swollen shut. On the hangar roof, 2 panels had lifted just enough for daylight to sneak through in thin, accusing lines. Owen stood in the doorway with a mug of instant coffee and made a list in his head of reasons selling the place was not just sensible but merciful. Nobody needed this much decay. Nobody needed to inherit a burden with wings. Ranger trotted ahead into the hangar, nails clicking softly on the concrete, nose already working. Owen followed with a flashlight, a rag, and a toolbox he had found under the shack's sink, though half the sockets were missing. He told himself he was only checking the aircraft for the broker. A few photographs, a basic condition report, enough information to keep some buyer from claiming he had hidden the bad news. The Cessna waited in the dimness, patient and dusty. Owen wiped a circle on the windshield with his sleeve and saw his own reflection warped in the glass. Tired eyes. 2 days of stubble, hair flattened on one side from sleeping badly. He looked older than 41 and somehow less finished than he had at 25. "Don't look at me like that," he said to the airplane, because talking to machinery had always come easier than talking to people. He walked around the fuselage, checking the tires, the struts, the tie-down rings, the skin for corrosion. His hands remembered before his heart did. Thumb along a rivet line, palm flat against aluminum. Fingers testing a latch gently, never forcing what age might have made brittle. The left tire was soft but not split. The flap hinges needed work. The cargo door stuck, then released with a cough of dust that made him turn his face away. Inside, the cabin smelled of old vinyl, sun-faded canvas, mouse droppings, and the faint sharpness of dry fuel lines. Ranger climbed in before Owen could stop him. "Easy," Owen said. But the dog was already standing in the cargo area, still as a statue, head lowered. His ears came forward. Then he sniffed the floor once, twice, and pressed his nose along the seam of a rectangular panel beneath the rear cargo mat. Owen frowned. "What is it?" Ranger did not paw wildly or bark. He never wasted noise. He looked back at Owen, then lowered his nose again to the same seam. Owen pulled the cracked rubber mat aside. Beneath it sat an aluminum access panel, dull with oxidation, held by 6 screws that did not match the others around it. That bothered him. Thomas Mercer had been many things, but careless with hardware was not one of them. Owen knelt, ran his thumb over the screw heads, and felt the faint lift of something that had been opened, closed, and hidden on purpose. His pulse changed before his thoughts did. "Dad," he whispered, not as a question, not exactly as an accusation. The first screw resisted. The second turned cleanly. By the fifth, sweat had gathered between Owen's shoulder blades, though the hanger was still cool. Ranger sat beside him, watchful, his tail resting against Owen's boot. When the last screw came free, Owen slid the panel up. For a moment, there was only darkness beneath the belly of the old plane, a narrow compartment where no compartment should have been. Then his flashlight caught the edge of a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. He reached in carefully and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. Not gold heavy, not money heavy, memory heavy. The kind of weight a man feels before he understands what he is holding. The latches were stiff. Owen opened them with both thumbs. Inside were logbooks bound with cracked leather, bundles of letters tied with faded blue string, Polaroids, fuel receipts, hand-drawn maps, and a small notebook blackened at the corners from years of being handled with dirty fingers. On top lay a folded sheet of paper. Owen opened it. His father's handwriting moved across the page in the same firm, slanted lines Owen remembered from maintenance tags and birthday cards that arrived late. For the flights nobody paid for, and the people nobody counted. The hangar seemed to go quiet around him. Even the wind outside slipped away. Owen read the sentence again, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less personal. Ranger leaned closer, his breath warm against Owen's wrist. Owen lifted the first logbook and opened to a random page. Dates, weather, routes, names he did not know. Dry Creek to Helena, Ridge Meadow to St. Luke's, Elk Fork to Missoula. Besides several entries in the payment column, Thomas had written the same phrase over and over, paid in full. But there were no dollar amounts, no invoices, no checks, just notes in the margin, plain and quiet as stones laid on a grave. Made it home. Still here. Owen sat back on his heels. Dust clung to his hands. The old resentment inside him did not vanish. It shifted, unsettled by a truth it had not prepared to meet. He had come to price a dead man's junk. Instead, Ranger had found the part of Thomas Mercer that had been hidden under the floor, waiting in the dark, not asking forgiveness yet, but asking to be read. Owen stayed on the concrete floor longer than his knees wanted him to. The first logbook lay open across his thigh, its pages softened by age, corners darkened from oil and weather, and the touch of a man who had used it often but carefully. Ranger sat close enough that his shoulder pressed against Owen's boot, steady as a sandbag, his amber eyes moving between the box and Owen's face. Outside, late morning heat climbed the metal walls of the hangar, making them tick and pop, but inside the old aircraft's shadow, time seemed to fold in on itself. Owen turned one page, then another. What he found was not dramatic in the way people expected secrets to be. No hidden fortune, no confession written in panic, no map to buried money, just dates, names, routes, weather notes, fuel totals. The plain arithmetic of mercy. Dry Creek to Helena, 1 passenger. Heart medication pickup, paid in full. Ridge Meadow to Missoula, 2 passengers. Road washed out after heavy rain, paid in full. Elk Fork to Butte, clinic supplies, generator belt, insulin cooler, paid in full. Each entry was written in Thomas Mercer's controlled hand. The same hand Owen had once watched tie knots, tighten bolts, and tap the altimeter before takeoff. In the margins, where most pilots wrote crosswind notes or maintenance reminders, Thomas had written smaller sentences, private and almost shy. She walked in on her own. He kept his appointment. They made it before dark. Still, here Owen swallowed, but the dryness in his throat did not move. He picked up a bundle of letters tied with blue string. The top envelope was addressed simply, Tom, Juniper Ridge. Inside, a woman named Ruth Bell thanked him for flying medical supplies to a mountain clinic during a week when the main road had been cut by a rock slide. Another letter came from a rancher named Luis Ortega, who wrote that Thomas had brought a replacement pump part across the valley during a drought, saving his herd and, in his words, the last honest thing my family had left. A third was from a retired miner whose lungs had gone bad, thanking Thomas for a flight to a specialist in Billings when he had been too proud to ask his own brothers for help. Owen read them slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because they kept changing the shape of the man he had buried. Ranger lowered his head onto Owen's knee, a quiet weight that felt almost deliberate. You knew, Owen murmured, though he had no idea whether he meant the dog, the plane, or the land itself. He opened the small black notebook. It was not a formal log. It was messier, more human. Some pages held phone numbers. Some held grocery lists. One page held a sentence underlined twice. A person is not a burden because they need help. Owen stared at it until the letters blurred. He thought of all the times he had felt like freight in his own life, something heavy other people had to move around. He thought of the way Marla had stopped asking how he slept, the way employers praised reliability but looked away from exhaustion, the way men like him were expected to come home, stand straight, find work, say thank you, and never make anyone uncomfortable with the truth. His father, it seemed, had understood a thing Owen had spent years refusing to name. People did not lose dignity when they needed help. They lost it when the world made them feel ashamed for needing it. Page after page, Thomas had pushed back against that shame with fuel, time, and an old Cessna. Not loudly, not perfectly, not in speeches, in flights, in arrivals, in getting one person from here to there when here had become impossible. Owen leaned back against the Cessna's tire and closed his eyes. The anger was still there, but it had lost its clean edges. It no longer knew where to point. Maybe Thomas had failed him in ways that mattered. Maybe that was true. But another truth had been sleeping under the floor of this airplane, and Ranger had dragged it into daylight. His father had not been chasing the sky. He had been building a bridge over the places where roads ended. Owen opened the logbook again and found the final entry, dated 3 days before Thomas died. Juniper Ridge to Dry Creek, 1 passenger, no charge. In the margin, the handwriting trembled slightly, but the words were clear. Still here. Owen ran his thumb beneath them. For the first time since crossing the gate, he did not think about selling. He thought about listening. The first visitor came just after noon, when the heat had settled over Juniper Ridge in a flat, shimmering sheet, and Owen was still sitting on the hangar floor, with his father's logbook open beside him. Ranger heard the truck before Owen did. The shepherd lifted his head, ears angling toward the service road, not alarmed, only attentive. A faded green pickup rolled through the gate, slow enough to raise more dust than noise, and stopped near the shack. Behind the wheel sat a woman with silver hair tucked under a red scarf and sunglasses large enough to hide half her face. She climbed out carefully, carrying a pie box in both hands like an offering. "You're Tom Mercer's boy," she said, not asking. Owen stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "Owen, Mabel Ross, I run the diner down in Dry Creek. Ran it with my husband before he passed." Her eyes moved past him to the Cessna, and something in her face softened so quickly Owen almost looked away. That plane got him to Helena in 2018. Road was gone at mile marker 22 after the slide. Ambulance couldn't get through. Tom said he wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to shorten a mountain. She smiled, but it trembled at the edges. Frank lived 4 more years because of that flight. Good years. He got to sit on our porch every evening and complain about my coffee. Owen did not know what to say, so he accepted the pie. Peach, still warm. Mabel looked down as Ranger approached. The old dog sniffed her hand once, then allowed her to scratch behind his ear. "Smart one," she said. "He looks like he's been waiting for you to catch up." She left before Owen found the right thank you, and for a while he stood in the dust holding the pie like proof of a language he had forgotten how to speak. By 3 o'clock another truck came, then a station wagon, then a sun-faded work van that coughed twice before shutting off. They did not arrive all at once. That would have been easier to distrust. They came the way weather changes in the valley, gradually, then unmistakably. Hank Delaney, 73, retired mechanic, brought a 5-gallon bucket of bolts, hinges, and aircraft-grade fasteners wrapped in shop towels. "Your old man kept my generator breathing the summer the grid failed," Hank said, squinting toward the hangar roof. "Wouldn't take money. Said I could pay him by not letting good tools rust. Looks like I'm late, but not too late." Luis Ortega arrived with a flatbed trailer carrying an old mower, 2 fuel cans, and a coil of rope. He wore a sweat-stained hat and had hands browned and cracked from sun. "Tom flew a pump seal out to my place during the drought," he told Owen. "That seal saved my well. My well saved my herd. My herd saved my ranch. People call that luck when they don't want to admit somebody helped them." Ruth Bell came last that day, walking slowly with a cane, her gray hair cut short, her posture still carrying the discipline of the nurse she had once been. She brought a manila folder thick with letters, clinic forms, receipts, and photographs of adults standing beside the Cessna, some smiling, some leaning on canes, some too tired to do more than lift a hand. Your father was not sentimental, Ruth said, settling into the porch chair Owen had repaired an hour earlier. Thank God. Sentiment doesn't clear a ridge in bad wind, but he respected people. There's a difference. He never made anyone feel rescued. He made them feel expected. That sentence stayed with Owen longer than the others expected. As if help did not lower a person. As if needing a hand did not make a person smaller. As if dignity was not something granted by the comfortable, but something protected by anyone decent enough to notice when the world tried to take it. As the sun lowered, the porch filled with voices, not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just steady, ordinary recollections. A ride to a specialist, a delivery of medication, a flight after a bridge washed out, a spare part brought over the hills when a business was days from closing. Every story placed one more board across the gap Owen had kept between himself and Thomas. He still remembered the empty chairs at dinner, the birthdays delayed, the calls that came before conversations could finish. Those memories did not disappear. But now they stood beside other memories, borrowed from people whose lives had bent because his father had shown up. Ranger lay at Owen's feet, chin on his paws, watching the visitors as if he had invited them. Owen looked toward the hangar. The Cessna caught the evening light along one dusty wing, and for the first time it did not look abandoned. It looked surrounded. Grant Whitmore arrived the next morning in a black Range Rover, so clean it looked imported from another weather system. By then Owen had been up since sunrise, cutting a rough path through the runway grass with Luis Ortega's old mower, while Ranger watched from the shade of the hangar, his tongue out, his eyes half closed but never careless. Dust hung in the air. Sweat darkened Owen's shirt between the shoulders. The airfield smelled of chopped weeds, hot rubber, and peach pie cooling in the shack, because Mabel had insisted a man could not make decisions on gas station coffee alone. The Range Rover rolled through the gate without hesitation, tires whispering over the dirt, as if even the road had decided to behave. The man who stepped out was tall, maybe late 40s, with silver at his temples, polished boots, and a white linen shirt that had not yet met the valley. He removed his sunglasses slowly, and gave Juniper Ridge the kind of smile buyers give old houses before they tear out the walls. "Mr. Mercer," he called. Owen shut off the mower. The sudden silence felt rude. "Depends who's asking." The man crossed the yard with one hand extended. "Grant Whitmore. Whitmore Land and Hospitality. I left 2 messages with your attorney in Boise. I hope I'm not intruding," he said, intruding as if the word had never once stopped him. Owen shook his hand because his mother had raised him before the Army finished the job. Grant's grip was warm, dry, practiced. Ranger rose from the shade and walked to Owen's side. He did not bark. He simply stood between the stranger and the open hangar, his body calm, his attention absolute. Grant glanced down and smiled. "Beautiful shepherd. He knows it," Owen said. Grant laughed, but only with his teeth. His gaze moved over the runway, the shack, the hangar, then settled on the Cessna visible in the dim interior. "I'll be honest. Places like this are rare. Private airstrip, mountain views, rustic aviation history. Close enough to Missoula for weekend traffic, far enough out to feel untouched. There's a market for that." Owen wiped his hands on a rag. "A market for what, exactly? Experience," Grant said, as if revealing a kindness. "High-end glamping cabins along the ridge. A tasting room in the old shack. The hangar restored for weddings and corporate retreats. The airplane could stay, of course. Cleaned up, lit properly, made into a centerpiece. People love a story." The last sentence landed wrong. Owen thought of Thomas's logbooks stacked inside the shack, of Ruth's folder, of Hank's bucket of fasteners, of the words "still here" written beside names Grant would never learn. "It already has a story," Owen said. Grant tilted his head, generous with patience. "Absolutely. And that's what I respect. My team specializes in preserving character while making properties financially viable. Too many families inherit places like this and drown in maintenance costs. Taxes, insurance, liability, environmental concerns, it becomes an anchor." He reached into a leather folder and removed a slim packet. "I'm prepared to offer $180,000. Cash, quick close. No contingencies that would burden you." The number moved through Owen before he could stop it. 180,000. It sounded like doors opening. It sounded like the credit card balance disappearing, the truck getting new tires. An apartment with clean walls, a few months of breathing room without shame sitting on his chest. Grant must have seen the flicker because his voice softened. You served, didn't you? Owen's eyes lifted. Army Aviation Support. Then you know better than anyone that old equipment needs resources. Sentiment won't keep a runway safe. Ranger shifted, one paw forward, not threatening, just present. Owen felt the dog's shoulder touch his leg. The pressure steadied him. You ever fly out of here? Owen asked. No. Know anyone who did? Not personally, then maybe don't call it sentiment yet. Grant's smile thinned, but he recovered quickly. Fair enough. Take your time. Walk the property. Imagine what it could become instead of what it used to be. He handed Owen a card, thick and matte, with raised lettering. You have my number. After the Range Rover left, dust settled slowly behind it, softening the tire marks until they looked older than they were. Owen stood in the heat with the card in his hand. Ranger nudged his wrist once, not a command, not comfort exactly. A reminder. Owen looked toward the hangar where the Cessna sat in shadow, no longer a relic but not yet a promise. $180,000 could buy escape. But for the first time, Owen wondered what it might cost. By evening, the offer sat on the table like a loaded question. $180,000. Owen had written the number on the back of Grant Whitmore's card without meaning to, then circled it once, as if math could become mercy if he stared long enough. The shack had cooled with the sunset, but heat still lived in the walls, breathing out through the tin roof in little metallic sighs. Ranger lay beneath the table, his body stretched long across the floorboards, one ear tilted toward Owen, the other toward the open door. Outside, the runway faded from gold to gray. Crickets started in the grass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a truck moved along the county road, then disappeared into distance. Owen opened his banking app and looked at the balance again, though he already knew the number. $390.17. A man could pretend not to care about money until the screen glowed in his hand and told the truth plainly. The truck needed tires. His phone bill was due. The divorce attorney still had one invoice unpaid. There were boxes in the bed of the Ford because he had nowhere better to put them. Grant's offer was not just money, it was an exit sign. Owen leaned back in Thomas's chair, and the wood creaked under him. You know what people do with exits? He said to Ranger. They take them. Ranger did not move. Owen picked up the contract packet again. The language was clean, polished, bloodless. Acquisition, transfer, redevelopment. Preservation of historical aesthetic where commercially reasonable. That phrase made him stop. Historically reasonable grief. Commercially reasonable memory. He imagined the hangar painted warm white, string lights hung from the rafters, couples posing beside the Cessna with champagne glasses, nobody knowing Ruth Bell's folder had once sat on its wing. Nobody knowing a retired miner had gripped that same doorframe while trying not to show fear. Maybe that was fine. Maybe places did not get to choose what they became. Maybe men did not either. Owen pushed away from the table and stood too fast, the chair scraping behind him. Ranger lifted his head. Don't look at me like that. The dog rose anyway, and followed as Owen crossed into the hangar with a flashlight in one hand and his father's black notebook in the other. He had brought it out there because he intended to put it back in the metal box. That was what he told himself. Put the past away. Sell the property. Stop mistaking obligation for purpose. The Cessna sat quiet in the dark, its windshield catching a thin blade of moonlight from the open doors. Owen climbed into the cargo area and lowered himself onto the worn floor. Ranger stayed just outside the door, front paws on the step, unwilling to leave him alone with whatever waited there. Owen opened the notebook to the page he had marked earlier, phone numbers, fuel notes, a grocery list, coffee, spark plugs, dog biscuits. He almost smiled at that, because Thomas had never owned a dog, not officially, though half the strays in Dry Creek seemed to trust him. Then Owen turned one more page and found an envelope tucked into the binding. His name was written across it. Owen, not son, not Buddy, just Owen in Thomas's firm hand. For a long moment he did not open it. His thumb rested under the flap and the old anger rose with surprising strength. 9 years dead, and now the man wanted to talk. 9 years of silence, and now paper had courage. Ranger gave a soft breath, not quite a whine. Owen opened the envelope. The letter inside was short. That almost broke him more than if it had been long. Owen, if you are reading this, I likely ran out of time before I learned how to say things properly. You always thought I left because the sky called louder than home. I let you think that because I was ashamed that words came harder to me than weather. I wanted to teach you something, but I taught it poorly. A person is never a burden just because they need help. If Juniper Ridge is still standing, keep it open if you can. Not for me, for whoever needs a place to land without feeling small. Owen read it once, then again. The flashlight shook slightly in his hand, throwing the words into and out of shadow. He pressed the heel of his palm against one eye, angry at the wetness there, angrier that the letter had arrived too late to argue with. Ranger climbed fully into the plane and settled beside him, heavy and warm. Owen leaned his shoulder against the dog's ribs. I don't know if I'm that man, he whispered. The hangar gave no answer, but outside the runway lay in the moonlight, not repaired, not safe, not ready. Still there. Grant Whitmore returned 2 days later with a cleaner shirt, a brighter smile, and a better number. $220,000. He said it gently, almost kindly, standing in the open mouth of the hangar while the afternoon sun laid long bars of light across the concrete. That is more than fair, Owen, he said, using his first name now, as if they had earned something between them. It gives you freedom. It gives this place a future, and frankly, it saves you from a responsibility you never asked for. Owen stood beside the Cessna with a clipboard in one hand and grease under his fingernails. Ranger sat at his left heel, calm but upright, his ears forward, his body angled between Grant and the airplane. Behind Owen, the hangar was no longer empty. Mabel Ross stood near the workbench with a pie carrier tucked under one arm. Hank Delaney leaned on a cane he pretended not to need. Luis Ortega had his hat in both hands. Ruth Bell sat in a folding chair, a manila folder across her lap, her eyes clear and sharp behind thin glasses. A dozen others had come too, not as a crowd looking for drama, but as people who understood that some places are not defended by volume. They are defended by memory. Grant noticed them, of course. His smile held, but the warmth drained out of it. I wasn't aware we were having a meeting. Neither was I, Owen said. Then people started bringing paperwork. He set the clipboard on the wing. For most of his life, paperwork had felt like a thing men hid behind. Divorce terms, discharge forms, bank notices, polite letters that carried bad news. But his father's papers were different. Flight logs, county letters, clinic receipts, fuel notes, names, dates, weather. Proof that kindness had once kept better records than greed. Owen lifted a yellowed agreement from the stack. In 2006, Dry Creek County entered Juniper Ridge as an auxiliary emergency landing site. Not public property, not charity, but recognized as a community access point during road closures, medical transport, supply delays, and regional emergencies. Grant's jaw moved once. That designation is old. Old isn't the same as dead, Ruth said quietly. Hank gave a short laugh through his nose. Owen continued before the moment could turn into an argument. There are maintenance gaps, I know that. There are insurance issues. I know that too, but there is also a renewal process. I called the county clerk. I called the aviation board in Helena. I called a man who still remembers my father filing these forms in person because he didn't trust fax machines. Mabel smiled at that, small and sad. Grant slipped his hands into his pockets. Even if renewal is possible, it requires money. Yes, Owen said, and labor. And witnesses. He looked over his shoulder. Luis stepped forward first, placing a folder of ranch records on the table. Ruth added clinic letters. Hank set down photos of the old runway crew. Mabel laid a stack of handwritten statements beside them, each signed by someone whose life, job, health, or dignity had once passed through this hangar. The paper made a soft sound as it landed, not loud, final. Grant looked at the table, then at the airplane, then at Owen. You are making an emotional decision. Owen felt Ranger's warm shoulder against his leg. He thought of the courthouse, of the cardboard box, of his father's letter trembling in flashlight beams. Then he thought of Thomas writing still here in the margins where no one was supposed to look. No, Owen said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. For the first time in a long while, I'm making a human one. Grant stared at him. The hangar held its breath. Outside, dry grass moved in the wind along the runway, shining gold under the late sun. Owen picked up the purchase agreement, folded it once, and handed it back. This place was never abandoned, he said. We were just late coming back to it. Grant took the papers. For a second, he looked as if he might try another angle, another polished sentence, another version of the future where history became decor and dignity became branding. But there were too many witnesses in the room, too many names on the table, too much truth standing quietly in work boots and worn denim. He nodded once, thinly, and walked out into the dust. No one cheered when he left. That would have made it smaller. They simply stayed. Mabel opened the pie carrier. Hank studied the hangar door track. Luis looked down the runway and said the south edge needed mowing before sunset. Ruth placed Thomas Mercer's old logbook into Owen's hands. Ranger stood, stretched, and walked to the Cessna's open door as if taking his post. Owen looked at the people gathered around him, then at the airplane, then at the long strip of land leading toward the mountains. For the first time, Juniper Ridge did not feel like something he had inherited. It felt like something that had been waiting for him to become ready enough to receive. Keeping Juniper Ridge did not make Owen Mercer brave overnight. It made him busy. That was better. Bravery could sound too clean when people said it from a distance. Busy had grease under its nails, sunburn on its neck, and a list that grew longer every time one item was crossed off. By October, the runway had been cut low enough for the wind to move over it cleanly. By November, Hank had the hangar doors rolling without that wounded metal scream. Luis brought gravel for the worst ruts. Mabel organized Friday suppers at the diner with a coffee can labeled "Keep the Ridge Open." And Ruth Bell helped Owen file renewal papers with the county in a handwriting so neat it looked like it still expected people to behave. Ranger became the unofficial supervisor of everything. He slept in the shade of the Cessna's left wing, inspected every visitor with grave patience, and followed Owen from shack to hangar to runway, as if making sure the man did not mistake motion for healing. Some days Owen still did. Some days he woke before dawn with old pressure sitting on his chest and reached for problems because problems had handles. A corroded bracket, a missing form, a fuel line that needed replacing. But there were other mornings now, too. Mornings when he opened the hangar and the first light touched the Cessna's nose, and instead of seeing his father's absence, he saw a question waiting to be answered well. The airplane did not come back easily. Nothing worth saving ever did. The engine had to be pulled, inspected, argued over, and rebuilt by men who drank too much coffee and spoke in measurements. The tires were replaced. The windshield was polished until the world outside looked less like a memory. Owen logged every repair with almost military precision, but on the inside cover of the new maintenance binder, he taped Thomas's sentence. "A person is never a burden just because they need help." He read it more often than he admitted. Ranger was beside him the afternoon the Cessna started for the first time in nearly a decade. The prop turned once, coughed, turned again, then caught with a rough, living roar that rolled out of the hangar and across the valley. People came out from the shack, from trucks, from the edge of the runway. No one cheered at first. They only listened, faces lifted, as if an old heart had remembered its rhythm. Owen stood by the wing with one hand on Ranger's back, feeling the vibration through the dog's ribs and into his own palm. He thought he might cry, but what came instead was a laugh, quiet and surprised, like something had slipped through a door he had forgotten to lock. The first real call came 3 weeks later after heavy rain loosened part of the canyon road south of Dry Creek. Not a disaster, not a headline, just one of those ordinary emergencies that can shrink a person's world in an hour. Walter Grimes, 79, a retired lineman with a stubborn heart and an appointment in Helena he could not miss, stood at the edge of the runway with a canvas bag in one hand and embarrassment all over his face. "I hate needing this," he said. Owen looked at him, then at Ranger, who sat calmly beside the Cessna, as if the old dog understood this was the point of everything. "You don't need to hate it," Owen said. "You just need to get in." The flight was short. Dry Creek fell away beneath them in squares of pasture, Silver Creek bends, and roofs bright in the morning sun. The Bitter Glass Range rose ahead, not blocking the way this time, only marking it. Walter said little during the flight, but when they landed, he gripped Owen's hand with both of his. "Your father flew me once," he said. "I figured that was the last time anyone would come this far for me." Owen felt the words settle somewhere deep, not as praise, but as responsibility. That evening, after returning to Juniper Ridge, he opened Thomas's old logbook and placed it beside a new one. Ranger lay at his feet, tired from a day spent waiting like waiting was sacred work. Owen wrote slowly. Dry Creek to Helena, 1 passenger, made it home. In the payment column, he paused. Then he wrote the words his father had written so many times before. paid in full. Outside, sunset poured over the runway in copper and rose. The hangar door stood open. The Cessna cooled with soft clicks. Ranger rested his head against Owen's boot, and for the first time in years, Owen did not feel like a man trying to outrun what had happened to him. He felt planted. Not fixed, not finished, planted. Juniper Ridge was no longer a place where the past had been stored. It was a place where dignity could land, refuel, and rise again. If this story touched you, take a second to like and subscribe so more stories like this can find the people who need them. And tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you most, and where are you watching from tonight?